Hello again, everyone. I'm Father Joe Nazzle of Sanino Mission House in Berkeley. Monday, December 14th is my 40th anniversary as a missionary of the Precious Blood. My classmate Steve Park and I were definitively incorporated at Precious Blood Seminary in Liberty. It was the third Sunday of Advent, and so the quote on the front of our program that day was from the first reading that we hear this Sunday from the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because God has anointed me. God has sent me to bring glad tidings to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and release to prisoners, to announce a year of favor from the Lord. Steve and I heard in that quote a call to action. We were young and we couldn't wait to get out into the world to engage in the mission outlined by Isaiah. It's also the mission Jesus embraced as his own when he stood up that day in the synagogue in his hometown, unrolled the scroll, and declared that the vision of Isaiah was now fulfilled in him. This became Jesus' mission statement, and it serves as a clarion call for our own mission as disciples of Christ. In many ways, today's readings reflect our identity as people of faith. The first reading reveals the mission of the servant of God, and the gospel reveals the missionary, John, sent from God to testify to the light. But John is very clear. He's only there to testify to the light, to point to the light, to reflect the light. He was not the light. And yet that light shines in each of our lives. It may be hard to detect these days because of the ongoing pandemic and the sheltering in place and the wearing of masks. And yet look above those masks and see the light that shines in the eyes of the other. This is the spark of the divine that dwells within each of us. It is that light of Christ that illuminates the darkness, that clouds our vision and hovers over our world. John the Baptist was so filled with this light that he was creating a firestorm in the desert. His passion and his preaching were burning away the debris of sin and fear and death and creating a path for the birth of Christ, the light of the world. He was so on fire that many were going out to the desert to catch an ember or kindle within them the fire of God's love. So many, in fact, that the religious leaders were wondering if John was the long-awaited Messiah. They sent envoys to interrogate him. He told them who he was by who he wasn't. "Who are you?" they ask. "I'm not the Christ," John replies. "What then are you? Are you Elijah?" Notice how the interrogators shift from who to what rather quickly. They move from his identity, he's not the Christ, to his role. What are you? What are you doing? And John says he's not Elijah, nor is he the prophet. So now they're frustrated because they have to take some answer back to their superiors. They demand an answer. Who are you? So that we can give an answer to those who sent us. What do you have to say for yourselves? That's really the question for this week, isn't it? It's a good question for Advent, but it's a good question for any time, really. What do we have to say for ourselves? It's a question I'm pondering as I approach 40 years as a Precious Blood missionary, wondering where all those years went. But it's a question for each of us. What do we have to say for ourselves? John channels his favorite prophet by saying, "I am the voice of one crying out in the desert. Make straight the way of the Lord." This doesn't satisfy the inquisitors, because if he's not the Christ, or he's not Elijah, or if he's not the prophet, he's still baptizing. And obviously those who identify only as a voice lack the canonical status or the jurisdiction to baptize. The question, though, what do we have to say for ourselves? What do you have to say for yourself? Hints of accusation hidden in the spaces between the words. It's the question that parents pose to their children when they've broken curfew and come home late from a party. Well, what do you have to say for yourself? It suggests that the one who's asked the question has done something wrong or failed in some way. Because at the heart of it, it's a question of accountability, of taking responsibility. What do you have to say for yourself? John the Baptist really had very little to say for himself. He was very clear what and for whom he was living. His role was to prepare a way for the one who was to come after him. John the Baptist was not some disembodied voice in the desert crying out. He was a force of nature that called people to repair the breach between heaven and earth. And the one who would come after him would be the bridge, would be the repairer of that breach. He was always pointing away from his own claim to fame and pointing to the presence of the one who's coming after me. John's false self never got in the way of his true self, his true role in salvation history. So what do we have to say for ourselves? If we spend our lives focusing not so much on our accomplishments or our failures, but rather on the presence of the light among us and within us, then we will spend our lives testifying to the light, testifying and identifying with the poor and the imprisoned, the abandoned, the neglected, those unwelcomed or those unwanted, those who are held captive by fear, those incarcerated by their dogmas rather than liberated by their dreams. This third Sunday of Advent marks the halfway point of our journey toward the light of Christmas. It's traditionally reflected in themes of joy and justice. Isaiah begins by saying, "I rejoice heartily in the Lord. In my God is the joy of my soul." What is not lost in this joyous theme is justice. God has clothed me, Isaiah says, with the robe of salvation and wrapped me in a mantle of justice. One cannot express true joy when justice is denied. Paul picks up that theme in the second reading from Thessalonians, where he says, "Rejoice always." Well, joy comes from knowing who one is and who one isn't. We know joy when we live from our true self, our best self, rather than trying to impress others or live someone else's dream for us. True joy comes when, like John the Baptist, we testify to the light that dwells within us, the light of Christ, the light of love. May that light shine in our eyes above our masks this week to reveal to all those we meet the presence of the light of the world. May our light, may our eyes, the windows to our souls, always reflect that God is at home in our hearts. And we're not afraid to let that light shine to welcome others into the light of love. Take good care. Have a very safe week as we meet in prayer. Stay safe.